All right, hello, and welcome to a recap of budgetary policy. This is actually going to act as a little bit of a teaser for the revision lecture that I'm going to be holding in September. This is going to summarize all of budgetary policy in 12 slides. That's that plus that. We're going to try and do this as quickly as possible. We're just going to get through it very quickly. Hopefully less than a minute a slide to recap you on this whole topic in a very short period of time. So let's get going right away. Source of government revenue. These are three main things. Direct taxes, which are taxes which come directly out of either income or from businesses. Personal income tax, business tax, easiest two examples of them. Indirect tax are taxes which are placed on the sale of goods and services. Things like GST, excise taxes on petrol, alcohol, cigarettes. These are taxes consumers have to choose to pay if they want to use those goods or services. Non-tax government revenues, these include things like profits from government businesses and the sale of any government-owned assets. So if the government sells, say like a fleet of cars, that is going to be non-tax revenue. Source of government expenses. This includes government current and capital expenditure, as well as transfer payments. I don't tend to include transfer payments here that often because it confuses students when they talk about aggregate demand. When you talk about transfer payments with aggregate demand, they become an income, therefore private consumption spending. Current expenditure is wages and salaries of public servants, as well as their day-to-day operating expenses. So things like paying for flights for politicians from one state to another, flying the PM to the G20 summit, those kind of things. Capital spending includes things like infrastructure, as well as spending on equipment, health, education, etc. So things like the Westgate Tunnel project, a really big example of infrastructure spending. So that's a government expense or outlay. The budget outcome. There are three main budget outcomes. A balanced budget, which is when revenues are equal to outlays. A deficit, where revenues are less than outlays, so the government spends more money than they receive. And a surplus, where revenues are greater than outlays, which means the government receives more than they spend. We'll get into what they can do with each of those later on. The budget announced in May is also an estimate and may differ from the budget outcome based on sudden events in the economy. So things like COVID lockdowns in Sydney means that the government has to outlay more support payments through transfer payments for those COVID disaster payments overall. There's also the underlying budget balance, which is the budget outcome, so revenues minus outlays, minus any future funds earnings, so any long-term savings accounts the government has, and the sale of any government assets, as they do not have an immediate impact on the economy. Any of the earnings made from any of those two things are going to be used in the future. They don't affect the economy in this financial period. So ways the government may finance a deficit or utilize a surplus. So to finance a deficit, the government can borrow from the private sector by selling bonds or government securities. They can borrow from the RBA, however, this takes money away from the money supply and can put upward pressure on interest rates. Or they can borrow from overseas, which increases public debt and also net foreign debt overall. With a surplus, the government can repay foreign debt to hopefully bring down that public debt and net foreign debt, or they can save with the RBA for future periods. They can also put money into those special future funds accounts, like was mentioned before, which can then earn interest and pay dividends in future budgets. The relationship between the budget outcome and the level of public debt. So public debt is government debt, private debt is households and businesses. A deficit means more debt, which means more government or public debt. We have to borrow money to finance that deficit. A surplus means we're able to repay debt, which means there should be less government or public debt. Easy as that. Moving on. The role of automatic stabilizers, the cyclical component of the budget in influencing aggregate demand and stabilizing the business cycle. So automatic stabilizers happen without any government intervention. This is when automatically there is a change in the level of tax revenue and welfare or outlays or transfer payments by the government as economic activity changes. As we go along the business cycle, going up and down, when we're in an expansion, people are becoming more employed, they're earning more income, they're paying more tax on that income. At the same time, if more people are employed, the government is paying less transfer payments overall. That means the government's receiving more revenues, having less outlays, more likely to move us towards a surplus budget, which works to be countercyclical or contractionary in nature and pushes back into a contraction. As a contraction starts to occur, people start losing their jobs, they stop paying as much tax, they move on to a transfer income. That means less revenues for the government, more outlays going out. That means we're more likely to go into a deficit, which will then turn around the other way, start expanding again. So when economic activity slows, economic growth falls, unemployment rises, and therefore tax revenues fall and transfer payments, e.g. welfare, rise, making the budget outcome more likely to be a deficit. Discretionary stabilizers are structural components of the budget. So remember, automatic, cyclical, discretionary, structural, you could be asked in that terminology. These are deliberate policy changes made by the government which impact the budget outcome. So things like decreasing the small business tax to 25% will decrease government revenues and stimulate economic activity. This will mean that we are more likely to be in a deficit because of that expansionary policy. That is a deliberate change, discretionary change. Disaster payments given out during COVID lockdowns will increase government outlays and stimulate economic activity, make it more likely to be in a larger deficit. Moving on slightly more, the effect of automatic and discretionary stabilizers or changes in the budget on the budget outcome and or public debt. If there is more spending or less revenues being received, we are more likely to be in a deficit, and therefore there is more government or public debt. If there is less expenses going out or less outlays going out, we are more likely to be in a surplus, and therefore there will be less government or public debt. 3 to go. We're smashing through this. The stance of budgetary policy, expansionary or contractionary. If we're in a deficit, no matter how big the deficit, if the deficit's getting smaller, if the deficit's getting bigger, a deficit is expansionary policy. Any deficit where the government is outlaying more than they are receiving is known as expansionary. A surplus is always contractionary, no matter if the surplus is getting smaller, if the surplus is getting bigger, always contractionary. So if we're in a $100 billion deficit one year and we move to a $20 billion deficit next year, that is still expansionary policy. We are outlaying more than we are bringing in revenues. It's acting to try and expand the economy, therefore it is expansionary. You could talk about it being less expansionary, but it is still expansionary. Any deficit, expansionary, any surplus, contractionary. The effect of budget initiatives from the last 2 years on the Australian government's domestic macroeconomic goals of strong and sustainable economic growth, full employment and low inflation. So 2 examples of policies and how they affect each of these things. So decreasing the small business tax to 25%, this means businesses are more likely to invest and expand, therefore increased private investment spending leads to increased aggregate demand, sends a signal to businesses to increase production, which leads to increased economic growth. If there is increased production, this creates a higher derived demand for labour, which leads to increased employment, making it more likely we achieve the goal of full employment. If aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply, this can cause demand inflationary pressure, which can help us move towards the goal of low inflation, as we are currently at 1.1%. The $1,080 tax offset for middle income earners will lead to increased private consumption spending as households have more disposable income, which will lead to increased aggregate demand, which then sends a signal to businesses to increase their production, which leads to increased economic growth. More derived demand for labour, increased employment, more likely to achieve full employment. If aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply, this can cause demand inflationary pressure, which helps to achieve the goal of low inflation. There are 2 policies and how they affect aggregate demand. You are only talking about aggregate demand in this topic. The answer will never have aggregate supply elements to it because we are focused on aggregate demand policy. Lastly, the strengths and weaknesses of using budgetary policy to achieve the government's domestic macroeconomic goals and how these goals may affect living standards. So there are a whole bunch of strengths and weaknesses for budgetary policy. I recommend knowing 2 of each really, really well and being able to apply them to current events as they may pop up in a discuss or evaluate question, and the highest end students will tie those into current events. So a really good strength of budgetary policy is that it can target specific sectors. So things like low-income earners or businesses. During the pandemic, it's been really good at doing that by giving income support to those who need it. Short impact lag. If taxes decrease, the effect is felt instantly. So if the tax level for my income level decreased, the next pay I would receive that. That is excellent. As soon as that happens, I'm going to have more disposable income. I'm going to be able to do more spending. That should lead to increases in aggregate demand. For weaknesses, there are implementation lags. Some policies take a long time to be voted on and come into effect. Therefore, some things may be announced in May but not come into effect for years afterwards or months, depending on the system. There's also political bias, so the political party in power may favour certain areas. This has been seen recently where the government has been far more generous in supporting Sydney during their lockdowns than they were in support of Victoria. Therefore, goals are going to be achieved at different rates in different states. That is it for this topic. This has been 8 minutes and 50 seconds so far. We should get this done in under 10 minutes as I now do my summary stuff at the end. If you like this, I'm doing a revision lecture in September. The details for it are on my website. It is $20. Feel free to sign up and come along. I will go through all these things. I'll go through it slower so you don't have to pause me or slow me down to understand what's going on. But this is just a quick, brief understanding of these bits of content. We'll go through every single bit of key knowledge in those lectures. We'll look at some examples from VCAR, etc. I've written most of it already. If you have any questions at all, send me an email, sean@therunningeconomy.com. Go to the website, check out the blogs, etc. www.therunningeconomy.com. If you like this stuff, if you're watching this and you aren't subscribed yet, make sure you subscribe because it looks good on my numbers when I'm then promoting my business to other areas. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.